Chapter 59, A Song of Snakes. A Song of Snakes. A gnome watched the group about him, their table a small pocket of calm in the disorder and noise of the common room, warm sunlight already pouring through the windows. It seemed they were all up much later than usual that morning, and the coronet was busier for it, the room buzzing with guests from the inn as well as laborers and tradesmen from the surrounding slums, all taking their first, for some perhaps, only meal of the day. But the increase in patrons meant the service was slow to say the least, the three waitresses being kept more than busy bringing meals from the kitchens, and Jahara had disappeared off to the bar some time ago to place their order there in a bid to ensure they were served sometime before noon. Around the table, everyone seemed ill-rested. Last night's meeting and the group's suddenly uncertain future in light of the vampire's offer giving them all much to think on once they had retired. Cern looked grey with tiredness, though the man had confessed earlier that the 3 days around the full moon always took their toll upon him. Minsk too seemed uncharacteristically tired, the ranger watching the bustle about them with a distant look, and Ari was paler than usual, though it was not something that was affecting everyone, it seemed. Frithia and Herr Dallas were sat next to each other and recounting their evening, the pair laughing and half finishing each other's sentences in a companionable way that made a gnome feel unreasonably cross.
Oh, and do you remember those two who accosted us at the bar? How could I forget, my raven, the one fellow and his friend with the mustache? Oh, that one who looked like a walrus. I can barely believe he asked you to dance. Ah, he wasn't so bad, a bit lecherous, I suppose. You suppose? What was it he said to you?
Herr Dallas deepened his voice in sonorous pomposity.
Well, my dear. You certainly are a fine young filly.
They chorused, Frithia dissolving into laughter, Herr Dallas smiling darkly.
The odious dog, that he should even dare speak to you so. So, you had a nice time last night then?
Came Ari quickly, the sharpness of her interruption rather at odds with her carefree tone.
Where did you go, the Waterdeep package again?
The pair laughed merrily.
Packet, Ari,
correct Herr Dallas, sending her a fond smile, and Ari looked suddenly flushed.
The tavern is called the Waterdeep Packet. It means the mail boat,
added Frithia brightly.
Oh, I see,
the elf muttered, and a gnome frowned, turning away from them and wondering vaguely where Jahara had got to with the tea. He could see the woman through the press, stood at the bar and having what looked to be a rather heated discussion with the portly bald innkeep, Bernard. Finally, the man held up his hands as though to indicate he was not the person at whom she should be directing her ire, and the woman snatched up the tray to march back to them.
Here,
she announced, passing out cups, an airiness to her voice that sounded brittle, though the others did not seem to notice it, Frithia glancing up with a smile.
Finally! Where did you go for it, Karate you are? If you want it any quicker in future, get it yourself.
The druid snapped promptly. Frithia sighed, reaching for the teapot.
Sorry, Jahara, I was only joking.
Jahara slammed the last cup down with force enough to crack it.
Yes, just as you always do. When will you realize that your behavior has consequences?
Frithia sent the woman a bland look before dropping her attention to her tea, resigned, it seemed, to the woman's temper, Herr Dallas leaning in to whisper some comfort at her ear as Ari nervously offered to get the woman a new cup.
Here we are,
announced the maid as she at last appeared at their table, sounding cheerful though tired with it, the girl swiftly setting a large steaming pot of porridge in the center and stack of bowls and spoons in Ari's empty place.
And I can see you've your tea already, but do shout if you need anything further.
She turned and was gone in the blink of an eye.
We will never see her again,
murmured Herr Dallas, sending the red-haired girl next to him a smile which only broadened as Ari arrived back at the table and they finally began their breakfast. It seemed it was to be another somber affair though, people only speaking to ask for more tea or various condiments, and Inomen found himself wishing they could manage to have just one breakfast that did not involve a quarrel. If nothing else, it was very bad for the digestion.
So, where does our investigation lead us today?
Asked Cern finally as he finished the last of his porridge and pushed the bowl away from him, his eyes moving between Fritha and Jahara clearly, thinking this would be the opening that would reconcile them. The druid looked instantly uncomfortable, a slight flush rising in her tanned cheeks.
I am afraid our investigation will have to wait, I have somewhere I must be.
Wait, repeated Fritha, the first time she had spoken since their crossed words a good half-hour ago.
What could be more important than this? The sooner we find out where this Valigar is hiding, the sooner we can get Imoen back.
Fritha! The woman snapped, though she was given no chance for whatever excuse she intended to make, the girl suddenly on her feet and grabbing up her cloak.
Fine, then Cern and I will go by ourselves.
The man sent a tired look between the two women before standing with a sigh, and the pair left with a very curt farewell. Jahara ate the rest of her breakfast in silence, the woman glaring about the table as though daring them to say something, though she remained disappointed, and it was not long after that she departed too. Minsk shook his head as the door slammed shut.
Ah, boo, I agree, too many arguments for so early in the day. Come, friends.
He smiled, looking round at them all as he made to rise himself.
Let us to the tombs.
Jahara stood silent before the polished oak desk that she was unfortunately familiar with. The lean form of Galvary sat on the other side, gimlet eyes staring up at her from beneath a crop of dark brown hair. He had not said a word since he had bade her enter a few moments ago, perhaps hoping the silence would unnerve her enough to begin a rambled explanation of herself, though Jahara knew this tactic well enough and remained silent. Such paths only led to self-incrimination. So, he began eventually, leaning back in his seat so as to get a better view of her face.
Your leader, Fritha, is in alliance with vampires.
Jahara felt every muscle in her body tense in an effort to keep her expression neutral in the face of her overwhelming dread. She had just known what this summons, so prompt in its coming, was to be about. That stupid girl. She played in a game where she did not even know of half the players. And whose fault is that? Jahara quelled this turmoil to send Galvary a mild look.
And why would you say that?
Galvary snorted.
Come now, Jahara, do not bother to lie for her. Your group was seen last night arriving at the cemetery and meeting a contact from the Vampires Guild. So you freely admit we are being followed?
Jahara snapped, feeling a small swell of triumph at Galvary's unsettled look.
And?
She continued archly,
if the Harpers know of such a guild within this city, I would ask why they are not setting themselves most wholly against it.
Galvary flushed with anger, though his voice remained calm, albeit curt.
These are matters more complex than you realize, and the guild so far has only concerned itself with the shadow thieves.
Jahara snorted humorlessly, not bothering to hide her contempt.
You mean you will hang back and wait for one to wipe out the other before you move in to finish the thing? And as for you being followed,
continued Galvary, pointedly ignoring her last comment,
one could say such is justified considering the company your leader would keep. Has she allied you with the vampires? No, it was merely a meeting. They offered to help her to retrieve the friend I told you of, Imoen. And will Fritha accept their offer?
And here for the first time Jahara hesitated. Well,
would she? She says she is considering it, but I do not think so,
the druid answered eventually, though she might as well as not have bothered with the last part. Galvary's body suddenly rigid in his seat, the man staring up at her open-mouthed.
Considering it? You do not understand, Galvary,
Jaehaera continued, unable to keep the pleading tone from her voice now.
She has been working these last 2 months to retrieve her friend and is barely halfway. If you could only ask the seniors to use their influence.
The man cut her off with a shake of his head.
I have already asked them, their resources are all spoken for at this time. But that does not make this alliance any less abhorrent.
He sighed deeply, staring up at her, his eyes grave.
This is very disturbing, Jaehaera. You assured me she is not a threat, and now this you understand. I am going to have to inform the seniors of this development.
He shook his head again before dropping his attention back to the papers on his desk.
Dismissed.
Jaehaera stood there a moment, breathing heavily, everything she wanted to scream at him rushing through her mind before she turned on her heel and marched out. In the hallway, Derman was just where she had left him, the man straightening as he saw her and finding it hard to match her pace as she stalked along the corridor to clatter down the stairwell back to the main hall.
Jaehaera, what did he say? That the girl is no more than a monster. I cannot believe he tries to justify his actions.
She paused at the foot of stairs to whirl on him suddenly.
Did you know we were being followed?
Derman looked shocked, slowly shaking his head.
Followed? And no, I did not. Jaehaera, now calm down, this will help no one.
He pleaded as she turned to continue her furious pace, the woman marching across the main hall, heading straight for the exit.
Help! Ha!
She barked to a faded blue sky as she threw open the doors and stalked out onto the quays, finally halting her march to turn to her friend.
This situation has gone far beyond that I fear, driven by a man's desire for power, rather than to do what is right. Galvary intends to report all this to the seniors, though not without his own slant, I should not wonder.
Derman frowned, looking concerned.
Well, look at it from his point of view, Jaehaera, it must seem worrying. He assured the seniors that Fritha was not a threat, and now this happens. She is not a threat.
He sent her a grave look.
Jaehaera, you know her better than anyone, will she ally herself with the vampires? No.
She snapped, wrestling with herself before finally crying,
Oh, I do not know. I could not say so before, in front of Galvary, but even the fact she is considering it worries me, Derman. Yet, I do not know what to do. She keeps herself so closed off from everyone. She lost Imoen, and now Nalia, another who was close to her, recently quit our company, and yet again she is left without someone to confide in. She has you,
soothed Derman, Jaehaera cutting him dead with a bitter snort.
Me, oh, yes, and what a friend I am, constantly reporting on her to Galvary.
She sighed deeply and shook her head, resigned to feeling bad about this for a while yet.
I am sorry, Derman, I should go.
He nodded kindly and embraced her, the firm contact calming her slightly before they parted, the woman heading for the stone steps that led up to the next terrace, and by the time she had glanced back Derman had already gone, disappeared into the gloom of the hold. Cern focused on his breathing, just as Gragas had taught him to those many moons ago when he was newly arrived at the grove and first trying to control the wolf that now shared his skin. These last few days had been difficult, and though the fact they had coincided with the full moon had hardly helped, Cern knew such revelations would not have been easy to bear at any time. Before he had been so sure of everything, who he was and his place in the world and the greater balance that existed between all things, and now. He and Jahara talked about it yesterday after their meeting with the magistrate, the woman assuring him that they would not give up just yet and there were still other avenues to be looked into, but for all that, Jahara had not looked hopeful. It was that same afternoon that they had, despite the magistrate's warning to the contrary, returned to the northwest of the city to search for Dirl's estate, Fritha stopping some watchman in the street and getting directions by pretending to be on the way to visit her sister, a maid of his household. It was a solemn-looking place of grey stone, the high walls shielding what looked to be a grandiose house within. The property was set along one side of a large park where many seemed to flock, couples walking arm in arm, clerks enjoying some welcome fresh air with their noon meals, while nurses gossiped over the clack, clack, clack of knitting needles, half an eye always on their young charges as they shrieked and played. Cerned and the women had stayed there a good couple of hours, just sat beneath the trees watching the estate, but the only change was when a man, old but hale in look, left in a carriage and none of them had known enough to tell whether it had been Dirl or just a visitor to his house. Cern sighed, even the cirrus-streaked field of blue above not calming him as it once would have. Perhaps Magistrate Ionulin had been right. The life he led now was not one in which he could raise a child, perhaps he was better off growing up within this noble's household, and he imagined the boy more grown, playing in the park as the other children had been, unmindful of their fine clothes or the fussing of their nurses as they jumped and ran. But every time Cern considered even giving up on the boy, such pain. It was as though his whole body cried out against it. He glanced to the girl next to him ready to distract himself, Fritha setting a brisk pace through the slums, her previous argument with Jahara clearly fueling the march. That the woman had so promptly abandoned their investigations had intrigued him, and he had been speculating since the incident who could command such loyalty of her. Fritha clearly knew, considering her lack of questions on the matter that morning, and Cern wondered if vaguely if all in their company had such secrets.
So, have you and Jahara traveled together long?
He began circuitously, finally breaking the silence between them, the girl not sparing him a glance as she answered.
Since the spring. Oh, I see, not as long as I would have thought. And how did you meet?
Fritha turned to him, seemingly irritated by his questions.
Look, no offense, but hasn't she told you all this sort of thing already? Well, no, she was always rather reluctant to discuss you.
Fritha snorted, turning back to their path.
Well, I'm not exactly feeling particularly inclined to discuss her at the moment either.
Cern sighed to himself. The girl was clearly not in the mood for small talk. If he wanted to get anywhere, he may as well just ask her.
Where will Jahara have gone today?
Fritha shrugged indifferently.
To meet others of her kind. Druids. Not quite.
Cern frowned. He was not going to get to the source of this mystery anytime soon and turned his attention back to the subject the girl was likely willing to discuss.
So, where does our investigation lead us today?
Fritha sighed, halting her march to draw up a cord from beneath her tunic, an old iron key slowly spinning on the end.
This is the only thing of note we found at the fugitive's house.
She allowed him to take it from her hand, the girl edging closer that he could better examine it without strangling her.
There's something stamped onto it,
he said, letting his fingers run lightly over the raised letters. Fritha nodded, taking it back to return safely beneath her tunic.
Yes, and I was hoping it was the name of the locksmiths who made it. A reasonable assumption. You plan to ask around them, I assume. Exactly,
she agreed, already moving to continue her march,
which means today our investigation leads us to the promenade.
And so that was where they went. There were 3 locksmiths in and around Joaquin's Promenade and another one on the edge of the Bridge district, but unfortunately none had heard of a workshop with the name of anything in Wellings, though, as many had reminded them, if the key was to a large chest or strongbox, it may not have necessarily been made in Athkatla. The pair had just left the last workshop, the street a bustle of patrons and traders as they found themselves on the edge of the main bridge, the cries of gulls and street vendors competing in a relentless cacophony. Heavy white clouds were rushing overhead, moving in from the west, the salt on the air mixing with stagnant reek of the river beneath them as it slowly flowed towards the harbor. Frithla was leant against the nearby wall staring down into the churning waters, and Cernde could see she was disheartened by their failure. He took a step closer, leaning over the bridge as she was to gaze down at the jumble of wooden quays and shacks that clung like limpets to the stone supports, a scatting boats bobbing at their moorings.
I am sorry, we have yet to find the answers you seek.
Frithla sighed, turning to send him a rueful smile.
Ah, such is life. I mean, it's not much of a clue anyway, is it? It could be as Jahara says, just some old key that even this Valigar fellow doesn't know what it opens.
She sighed again, the smile fading, her face taking on an intense look as she stared down at the key she held.
But then I hold it in my hand and I can just feel it, its importance. She's so close now and all I need to do is find this man and perhaps she'll be returned to me.
Jahara had at least told him of this interesting twist to their greater goal, and Cernde knew exactly to whom Frithla was referring.
Was Imoen with you when you met Jahara in the spring?
Frithla glanced to him, seemingly deciding how to answer before she nodded once.
Yes, though not by design. She grew up with me, in Candlekeep, of all places. But this spring came and with it troubles, and Gorion, my foster father, thought it for the best that we leave the fortress for a time. We were on our way to meet Jahara and her husband, Khalid, when we were attacked. Gorion was killed though I escaped into the night, and the next day it was Imoen who found me. She had heard of the attack and willingly left the safety of Candlekeep in order to help me then, when I needed it the most. And now you mean to do the same for her?
Frithla smiled wryly.
That's the plan. Though, to be honest with you, I'm rather stuck at the moment.
She sighed, looking at least a little more cheerful as she straightened, tidying the key away back under her clothes.
Come on, we can go to the theater and think on this some more.
The 5 flagons was barely a stone's throw away, and it was not long before they were in the common room, the girl calling a greeting to Samuel as they passed, before she led them down the stairs into the depths of her theater. Cernde had never been to a playhouse and he did not really know what he had been expecting, though whatever it had been, it paled next to the change he noticed in Frithla. Throughout the time he had spent in her company, he had noted that, whatever the situation that arose, she had always carried herself with a certain confidence, as though she were comfortable in whatever situation life placed her in. But now, it was like watching a bird who had been hopping so neatly about the grass suddenly take flight, the effortless way she moved through the gloom of her theater, exchanging easy greetings with those that she passed, as though the troubles of the day were no more than memories, and Cernde could see that the playhouse was much more than just a business to her, it was a home.
Hello, Ketrick, how's your back today? Not too bad, milady. Ah, Davith, Higold tells me you've really improved your projection lately, well done. Thank you, Miss, milady. Lady Patron, I left the list you asked for on your desk, the one of prominent nobles and other luminaries for the opening night invitations. Oh yes, thank you, Alhina.
Down the central aisle she led them and up onto the empty stage, a brilliantly lit chaos of color as curtain and backdrops and huge gilt pillars all fought for the eye. Then she pushed aside a curtain and they were backstage, plunged suddenly into a world of dust and darkness, people hurrying about them in the gloom before at last they came to a door set in the wall under a narrow flight of stairs, the girl opening it to reveal a long narrow room, a huge gilt mirror at one end, while a rather battered dresser was set just opposite the door, the surface covered in neat piles of parchment and an oil lamp which was already glowing brightly, 2 worn armchairs. Before it, Fritha removed her cloak in one easy movement, laying it casually over the nearest chair and turning back to notice him lingering in the doorway.
Come in,
she smiled, gesturing for him to give her his cloak as well, though Cerned hadn't had even the chance to put down his staff when a brown-haired man a few years senior to him barged into the room. The druid placed him immediately as Higold, Fritha's much bemoaned director, a young boy he recognized as Mek close on his heels.
"Oh, Lady Patron," the man gasped dramatically, "Wynne said she saw you arrive and thanks be to Millil you did. We just cannot work under these conditions any longer. This morning a backdrop came down and nearly struck Althea as she was delivering her soliloquy." "Are you sure that was an accident?"
muttered Fritha, Mek snorting into his hand, though Higold had either not heard them or was pretending he hadn't.
"The poor thing is in the dressing room now trying to collect herself. She is refusing to rehearse another scene and rest of the cast is threatening to join her unless you do something about this curse. Why, even I can sense the malevolent spirits thronging about us. Just imagine the torment that one as sensitive as Althea must have been going through." "Yes, she's a real trooper,"
sighed Fritha dully, continuing with more enthusiasm as she stepped back to beckon politely to him and Cerned felt himself stiffen.
"Well, it just so happens that this is the very reason I am here now. Higold, let me introduce to you Master Cerned, a powerful shaman, all the way from the marshes of Trade Meat, no less, who is going to exorcise this evil."
Higold turned to him as though he had not even noticed his presence in the room before, the director giving him an openly appraising look and Cern's stomach tightened. He glanced to Fritha, the slightest twitch of her eyebrows the only thing to give away her deception, and he could see the expectant look to her eyes. Cern drew a deep breath, it was worth a try.
"That is so, my children. I have sensed a great unrest within these walls even upon my entering. If you would but lead me to the site of this latest manifestation, I shall begin my work in laying these troubled spirits to rest."
Higold nodded deeply, clearly impressed.
"Well, sir, I shall have someone lead you there this very moment, Mek." "Thank you, my lady."
The director continued with genuine gratitude as the boy led Cerned off towards the stage.
"You are, as ever, our most considerate patron. Now, since you are here, there is another much less serious, though just as disruptive problem I should like your assistance with. Just one moment, please."
He excused himself, turning to put his head back around the door and call, "Zurin." A few moments pause, in which Fritha sank into the chair behind her, before their male lead arrived, the blonde actor dipping her a polite bow, the script he held tightly rolled in his hand the only indication as to his annoyance. Higold cleared his throat slightly and began.
"Now, Zurin here has been improvising some of his lines for a good few days now. At first, I let it slide, but lately it has grown to the point where it cannot go on any longer. But this play could be so much better, my lady."
Zurin burst out, practically ignoring Higold as he stooped slightly to plead his case.
"The romance between Veldin and Karenina needs more passion, it would make the end all the more tragic for it. It also makes a shamble of rehearsals,"
countered Higold crossly, the director slumping into the chair opposite in his frustrations.
"No one knows where their cues are with you changing your lines every other scene."
Zurin sighed impatiently.
"And as I have already said, if you would but let me rewrite the lines in the script, then that would not be an issue. Here, my lady," he continued more politely, passing her the script he held, "I made notes of my changes on my own copy.
The man was clearly passionate about the attempt. Fritha could barely see the original typeface for the ink he had scrawled all over it. But Higold was just as impassioned about preventing the changes, it seemed.
Rewrite it? Rewrite the Sorcerer's Bane? The very thought borders on heresy. Such madness could ruin this playhouse. Or make it. You said yourself, Higold, the new lines are better. That is not the point. Now, you may not listen to me, but our patron you must heed. Tell him you forbid it, my lady.
Fritha glanced up from the script she had been trying to decipher. From what she could make of them, the alterations did all Zurin said and more, a rawer passion replacing lines that before had sometimes seemed more concerned with sounding clever than on communicating any real feeling.
My lady,
prompted Higold when she did not jump to agree with him.
The new lines are better, Higold,
she answered with a shrug, turning instantly to Zurin.
Do you really think you can do it?
Zurin stared down at her open-mouthed as though he could hardly believe what he had just heard.
What, you are letting me, oh, my lady, you are a wonderful woman. You will not regret this.
She smiled wryly.
Just make sure I don't. Ah, Master Cerned.
She continued as Mech appeared in the doorway, the druid just behind him.
Have you finished your exorcism?
Cerned nodded gravely, his voice mellow and almost ethereal in its cadence. The man had clearly got into the role.
Indeed, my child, the spirits of this place are now at rest.
Fritha slapped her palms together and began rubbing her hands briskly, making to rise.
Good, good. Well, if that is all, Higold, I need to discuss the good shaman's fee. What? Oh, very well.
Higold sighed, immediately standing to usher Zurin out before him, the actor already talking excitedly about the changes he wished to make as Mech shut the door behind them. Fritha slumped back into her chair, offering the seat opposite to Cerned with a grin that he shared. It was just another day at the theatre. And it seemed it was to be another night at the theatre too, Cerned leaving the girl there at sunset and making his way back to the coronet to find a very displeased Jahara propping up the bar, the man having little time to talk to her before the others of their company arrived back as well. They had enjoyed no more luck in the crypts than he or Fritha had had about the town, the four of them tired and dirty, having stumbled upon a nest of ghouls during their search, and none of them lingered at the table after they had finished the evening meal. Anomen, Ari, and Minsk all retired within minutes of each other, Herr Dallas promptly departing for the theatre and leaving Cerned and Jahara alone once more. Jahara leaned back in her chair, topping up both their cups with the last of the wine that was left over from their meal, her voice cool and indifferent as of one only making conversation for the sake of politeness until she could make her own excuses and leave as well.
So, what did you and Fritha get up to at the playhouse today? Did she have you helping with rehearsals?
Cerned smiled into his cup.
Not exactly, but I did exorcise the malevolent spirit of a young actress who died in the theatre over 100 years ago. You did what?
His smile broadened.
Yes, apparently the troupe are all a touch superstitious about the curse that hangs over their chosen play, and a spate of accidents was blown into a full-scale haunting. Higold appeared not long after we arrived saying that the cast were refusing to rehearse unless she did something, so Fritha took advantage of my being there and introduced me as the shaman she had procured to exorcise the place.
Jahara smiled for the first time that day, the woman laughing as she exclaimed,
"That girl! And what did Higold say?"
Cerned shrugged.
Oh, Higold seemed impressed enough. A part of me wonders if he even saw past my appearance. So what did you do? Well, the child, Mech, led me out onto the stage where the last accident occurred. The cast all huddled fearfully in the wings to watch, and I said that I could feel a strong presence there. I closed my eyes and began to sway slightly as I have seen other elder druids do when they are attempting to channel an animal spirit, and I just let my imagination take me from there. I had them all convinced I was communing with the spirit of some poor actress who had died on the opening night of the playhouse before she could make her debut.
Jahara was laughing warmly by this point, shaking her head.
By Sylvanus, and they believed you. You doubt my abilities as an actor, good Jahara.
Cern reproached genially, glad to see her cheered.
They most certainly did believe me, and I laid the spirit of that poor woman to rest to great applause.
He smiled, thinking back to the moment and Frith's reaction once he had returned to her office.
Fritha was as pleased as any of them and quite as amused as you have been when I related to her the tale over lunch.
He paused, sending the women a thoughtful look.
She is an odd girl, isn't she? Very different from how I would have imagined of one in her circumstances, but quite charmingly so.
Jahara smiled fondly, though her eyes seemed sad.
Yes. Yes, she is. I fear sometimes she uses it to hide something else though. She is always bad for it, especially when matters take a turn for the worst like this, the girl so desperately shielding herself with her good humor. I fear she loses herself in it.
Cern sighed, shaking his head.
It is an unfair decision that rests upon her shoulders, the choice between what you desire and the greater good. I know well enough its weight. You have been thinking more on your son,
Jahara confirmed, and he nodded tiredly.
What everyone says is so, that the child does not even know me as father, and who could wish for a more advantageous start for the boy, taken into such a household. Perhaps he truly is better off where he is. But then, when I consider just letting him go, a pain opens in my heart of such intensity I fear I would rather die.
He shook his head again, talking about the decision, bringing him no closer to making it.
Did you and your husband ever think to have any children?
Jahara sighed.
Khalid and I spoke of it, as many couples do, but it was never the right time. There was always something to be done, some new cause to fight.
She shrugged, reaching for her cup.
The opportunity has passed now and I feel no new regrets for it. I still have no desire to settle down.
Cern nodded, dropping his eyes and letting a finger absently trace along the looping wood grain of the table.
Yes, I thought I was the same, but now. All I have wanted in my life, ever since I can remember, was to serve nature and be at one with the land. But now I would trade it all my freedom, my grove, even resume my life here in the city if it would mean my child would be retuned to my care.
Jahara shook her head, nothing to say to it seemed, and Cern just reached for his cup as she had. Fritha smiled gratefully as the man before her picked up his tray and tried to sidle out through the press around the bar, pausing just long enough to provide her with an opening at the counter before moving off to be lost in the crowds. By the time Herr Dallas had arrived at the theater to see her that evening, she was more than sick of going through the reams of bills and paperwork that the place seemed to generate with only interruptions from a fretful Higold as respite, and the pair had left almost immediately to go carousing, as a disapproving Jahara would have likely termed it. They were in the 3 Tons now, a dingy low-ceilinged tavern in the very west of slums that she had not been in before, the air hazy with pipe smoke and the smell of sweat. Though for all that, it was clearly very popular, and Fritha suspected the very cheap ale they were selling by the barrelful might have had something to do with it. She glanced behind her, making sure she had not lost Herr Dallas in the crowds, the man easy enough to spot though he was not looking for her, instead focused intently on something in the tavern behind them, and she followed his gaze to a table of 3 men who were looking over a large square of parchment. They were mercenaries by their look, a grey-bearded dwarf and a man, his dark hair drawn back into a short stub of a ponytail, sat on one side of the table, and both of them bearing the arms and scars that places them as warriors, while their paler companion was more likely a mage by his ostentatious robes, his superior height making it all the easier for him to look down on his surroundings as appeared to be his wont. Their discussion over, Frithla watched as the robed man moved to fold up the parchment, though she did not see what happened to it then, the barman finally before her ready to take her order, and she thought no more on it until she had paid for their wine, Herr Dallas grabbing her elbow the instant she was free from the crowds and almost dragging her over to the men's table.
"A good evening, friends," he greeted. "It seems they are rather short of tables at the moment, perhaps we could join you? We've wine enough for all."
The three glanced up from their drinks, the robed man going almost instantly back to his as though the matter was beneath his interest, while the two warriors shared a frown, the dwarf raking dark appraising eyes over them before he answered gruffly, "If ye like." Herr Dallas smiled, drawing out a seat for Frithla next to the mage, before taking the place opposite as he continued genially,
My thanks, my thanks. I am Ladrith and this is my good friend, Carrot."
Frithla glanced across the table, Herr Dallas's face showing no hint of this lie as he served their wine, waiting for her to make her own introduction. This behavior was not so unusual from Herr Dallas as to catch her out though, for indeed they had played similar games before when they were out, the man seemingly enjoying such deceptions merely for the practice of it, and though Frithla had no idea what he was planning this time, she went along with it without falter. She smiled to the table as a whole.
"A pleasure, I'm sure."
The dark-haired warrior nodded politely. "Well, I'm Tay and this here is Corgan."
"I can speak for meself, boy,"
the dwarf snapped.
"Corgan Bloodaxe, hail and wassail to the pair of ye."
He raised his tankard to them before downing the contents in one, belching loudly as he reached out to help himself to their wine.
"And this is Oramus,"
said Tay, the robed man sending them a rather indifferent nod as his more martial companion continued,
"So, you two don't sound local, then?"
Herr Dallas laughed, sending Frithla a dazzling smile as he lightly clapped her arm.
"Indeed, how many times have we heard that lately, sister? We are travelers from Sigil, here on the Prime to broaden our horizons before Carrot resigns herself to a good few years of toil and study in a conservatory in the ladies' ward." "Oh, so you like plants then, m'lady?"
Tay inquired politely, the dwarf instantly bursting into loud laughter as Oramus snapped,
"He refers to a music school, you dolt." "Shut it, spell fiddler!"
Tay shouted back, a hand already on his blade hilt, Corgan seemingly unconcerned about the possible brawl about to erupt in his midst as he continued to laugh. "Har har har. Not an ounce
o' wit between the pair, oh yeah, I swear it."
The two men glowered at each other across the table, though they said no more, and Frithla could feel the tension over them fade, though not completely. There was clearly no love lost between the members of that group, and Frithla wondered why Ontoriel the tiefling had been so keen to join them.
"So you are mercenaries then?"
continued Herr Dallas as though nothing had happened.
"I can tell by the varied company you keep. I had heard the winter can be hard time for your brethren on the Prime, for the weather limits your work."
Tay grinned, looking immensely satisfied with himself.
"Ah, well, that may be so for some others, but we've a job that'll keep us in wine and wench."
A glance at Frithla revised things.
"Ah, warmth all the winter long." "Truly, Cutter? It must be quite the ride you've planned." "Oh, aye,"
nodded Corgan, taking another mouthful and swiping the foam from his beard with the back of his hand.
"Some addled pate mage wants us to fetch him some book from the city crypts. Sounds to be the easiest job I've ever had." "Aye, you said it,"
Tay agreed with a loud laugh,
"and that Mechrath's gonna pay us 500 coin for the task."
Herr Dallas sent her the briefest of glances, the only indication that he had recognized the name of his former captor.
"Quit your mouth, ya dem fool,"
snarled Corgan, slapping the man's shoulder for good measure.
"Do ya want everyone in the alehouse to know of it?"
"Quite, quite,"
Herr Dallas agreed, forestalling any further argument and glancing about them at the surrounding revelry with suspicion.
"Best to be peary, for you never know just who is listening."
"But,"
he continued, back to his genial self as he turned politely to Oramus,
"did I hear right that you are a spell slinger?"
Oramus blinked a moment, before nodding once.
"Well, yes, I am a mage, if that is what you mean."
Herr Dallas beamed, turning instantly to Fritha.
"Well, Carrot, it seems you are in luck. My sister here has always found magic fascinating."
Fritha just checked, rolling her eyes. She was going to kill Herr Dallas for this later, the girl smiling as the mage turned to her, pale grey eyes holding the first hint of interest she had seen in them so far.
"Really, my lady?" He can hardly believe it. Most lasses find his arcane prattle duller than a great thaw, ain't that right, spell chucker?
Sneered Corgan, and the two warriors laughed. Oramus bore it with no more than a flicker of irritation though, all his focus still on her, and Fritha nodded, dipping her face slightly in a hint to a coyness she certainly did not feel. Across the table, Tay looked rather disappointed.
"Oh yes, the weave, as you call it, has always been intriguing to me, though I thought its use was monitored quite strictly here."
Oramus snorted.
"Oh, it is, but I hold no fear of the cowled wizards, I do as I please."
"Gosh, how brave!"
Fritha gasped, all her concentration going into not to laughing. And the conversation went from there really, Oramus telling her long laborious stories of his studies and adventures in magic, regularly punctuated with overly flamboyant hand gestures, and all that was left for Fritha to do was nod and smile and make the appropriate exclamations of awe now and then. Across the table, it seemed Herr Dallas had got the much better deal in this charade, the three laughing and talking over each other as they drank and shared stories, the bard making very sure their cups never ran dry.
"Come now, Carrot,"
the tiefling scolded warmly as he leaned forward to top up her own cup,
"you have barely touched your wine."
Fritha sent him a smile, hoping he could feel the displeasure simmering behind it as she turned her attention back to the mage, Herr Dallas returning her cup with a grin. He did not set it back at her hand though, but a good few inches away, and Fritha watched, time seeming to slow, as Oramus made another pretentious sweep of his arm and knocked it neatly off the table.
"Ah!"
Fritha cried as the cup dropped into her lap, clattering to the floor an instant later, the cool wine soaking through her trousers.
"Oh hells!"
Oramus cursed, immediately fumbling at his robes to produce a dark green handkerchief.
"Your pardon, my lady, be silent, you too!"
he snapped as his companions roared with laughter, Fritha trying to soothe him as she held her tunic out of the way.
"Oh, please don't worry, it's mostly on my trousers, so it doesn't show, oh!"
she squeaked as he pressed the cloth firmly against her leg in his haste, the man seeming to realize what he had done the instant she had, dropping the handkerchief in his embarrassment. Tay and Corgan were laughing even harder now, the former with his head buried in his arms to hide the fact he was almost crying. Herr Dallas smiled kindly, sweeping over to help the man as Oramus dropped into a crouch to attempt to gather up her cup and his handkerchief both.
"Here, let me help you there, Cutter."
A flurry of movement and both men were stood once more, Herr Dallas cleaning her cup on his handkerchief, while Oramus was returning his own rather more stained one to his pocket. Herr Dallas sent her a friendly wink.
"There now, no harm done, Carrot."
"Not at all,"
Fritha replied, sending a kind smile to the mage, and Oramus nodded, looking relieved and rather more flushed than before as he returned to his seat.
"Here, my lady, allow me to pour you some more wine.
And the table resumed their friendly talk, Fritha and the tiefling drinking until this fourth and final carafe was empty, and Herr Dallas announced that they should probably be getting back to their lodgings in the promenade. Fritha, deciding she may as well do the thing properly, made a show of fussing over her coat and cloak so as to spend as long as possible in his company before she was forced to bid a fond farewell to Oramas, the girl breathing a deeply relieved sigh as they finally stepped outside into the cool night air.
"So, what do we fancy now?"
asked Fritha brightly as they started along the street.
"They've music over at Red Griffin tonight, or there's always the Waterdeep packet. Or how about a little tomb robbing?"
grinned Herr Dallas, and Fritha could hardly believe it as he drew a familiar square of parchment from inside his jacket.
"Oh, Herr Dallas, you didn't. I should have known you were up to something when you got me to flirt with that idiot of a mage."
But Herr Dallas just laughed, his eyes gleaming wickedly.
"Come, my raven, you heard what they said. It was to be an easy ride even for their meager trio, and it will be tomorrow before they even notice the map is missing, in their cups as they are. If we go now, no one need ever be the wiser, and you will have an extra few coins to put Galen's way."
Fritha stared back at him, his look earnest and bright in the twilight. Everything about this was wrong, stealing maps, breaking tombs. And yet for all that, there she was, stood in the forgiving darkness once more with her very dear friend, and she could not help but feel it yearning within her, the desire to nod and grin and enjoy a few hours in reckless freedom before the sun rose again and she was once more under the yoke of her responsibilities. Fritha sighed, indifferent and tired and much at odds with the excitement she felt quickening her heart.
"All right then, Sparrow, but if you want us to do this, you'll need to convince someone else to come along with us."
Herr Dallas looked genuinely surprised, perhaps he had expected them to leave straight away.
"But why? I have been in the crypts these last 3 days, and I can assure you there is nothing down there to endanger a cutter's life except for the boredom. Surely you are not afraid, my raven?"
he added teasingly. Fritha snorted.
"Not of anything in the crypts. You don't understand, do you? We go together, and who will get it in the neck? Me, because everyone already knows you're completely irresponsible. Blame isn't shared out like loot, you know, it just all falls squarely on most responsible person present. So we need to get someone else to join us in the venture,"
he confirmed.
"Well then, who?"
Fritha shrugged.
"It doesn't really matter. Everyone's more responsible than me, with you being the only exception. Oh, I can just hear them now."
She laughed, raising her voice an octave as she pretended to scold someone.
"Really, why on Toril did you listen to them? You know those two are just incorrigible when they get together."
Herr Dallas laughed.
"Well, then we had best get back to the inn and find ourselves a willing volunteer, hadn't we? Come, my raven, no time to lose."
And with that, he sprang up, herring off down the street in the direction of the slums, Fritha laughing as she tore after him.
"Well, I think I shall retire now,"
sighed Cernde, stepping rather unsteadily down from his stool.
"My sleep here is restless enough without adding any more ale to it, though at least the moon will no longer be a problem for me come the morrow."
Jaehaera nodded. She and Cernde had sat and talked for much longer than she had expected they would, the tavern about them slowly emptying as the hour grew late. The man sent her a parting smile.
"Good night, Jaehaera." "Yes, good night,"
she answered, knowing she would not be in the tavern much longer herself as she considered the half-drunk cup of wine before her, though Cernde had only just disappeared into the stairwell when a voice behind her cried her name.
"Jaehaera."
Jaehaera turned in her seat to see Fritha and Herr Dallas hurrying towards her, weaving through the press of empty tables, the girl flushed with cold and looking very pleased to see her.
Jahara, you're still awake, it's surely a sign. My Ptarmigan, is everyone else retired?
The druid frowned, wondering if the pair were somehow drunk, though they did not seem particularly into their cups.
Yes, Cerned was the last and he just retired a moment ago. What are you shrieking about, Fritha?
She demanded as the girl squealed delightedly.
Oh Jahara, we've got a map, a treasure map to book, a book in the tombs. You've a map to a tomb that contains some valuable book.
Jahara finally pieced together with a frown.
Where on Toriel did you find that? Well, we might have liberated from a group of mercenaries over in the 3 tons,
the girl admitted slowly, before continuing all in a rush,
but we left them well into their cups, so there's no way they'll be starting their expedition until the morning, and by the time they even discover they've lost the map we'll be well away. Liberated,
Jahara repeated dully,
so you stole it?
Yes, agreed Herdalis with the pride only a thief could exude.
And now we plan to steal the prize too, right out from under them.
Jahara sighed.
And how do you plan to get rid of this book once you've acquired it? You know it is nigh on impossible to fence anything remotely arcane in this city. Why, we will merely deliver it to the one who commissioned its retrieval in the first instance, my Ptarmigan. Oh yes, and have you considered that he might not be willing to accept it from just anyone?
Jahara pressed, but the tiefling merely shrugged.
Oh, don't think he'll be all that bothered. Mekrath never struck me as one who was particularly concerned about the niceties of such things, and besides.
He grinned roguishly.
All's fair in love and tomb robbing. Mekrath,
Jahara repeated, her voice rising.
The one from whom you had us steal that portal summoning bauble.
But Herdalis waved all this away with a frown.
Come now, Jahara, I will take the book to him myself. If you are concerned, he will lay that crime at our door.
Jahara drew back from them, a sense of foreboding welling within her, and Fritha looked instantly heartbroken.
Come on, Jahara, please. We can find another buyer if you're worried, it's easy coin in the purse, I promise fun.
She added in a sing-song voice. Perhaps it was the few cups of wine she had drunk that were helping her to this conclusion, but Jahara could feel herself being swayed. Fritha was not normally so reckless, but with everything that had happened lately and their group seeming to set themselves so stoutly against her over the vampires, the girl seemed rather more inclined to bite her thumb at what was expected of her, even if turned out to be something that was usually against her nature. And perhaps if they could earn some coin without having to trek halfway across and risk their lives to do so, Fritha would be more likely to refuse Bodhi's offer anyway. Jahara glanced to the pair, both gazing back at her with eager anticipation, and she wondered if she had ever seen Fritha looking so young. Pointless though it was, Jahara was feeling increasing guilty about her continued meetings with Galvary. Would it really hurt to just go down into the crypts and fetch out some book? Jahara sighed and shook her head, dropping from her stool to fetch up her cloak and staff.
I just know I am going to regret this.
Fritha laughed delightedly.
We should at least inform the others where we are going,
Jahara added sternly, Fritha already rooting in her bag.
I'll write a note for Minsk.
Fritha was hunched over the bar, having finally produced her stylus and a scrap of parchment, and Herdalis caught Jahara's eye, sending the druid a smile that she could not help but return, albeit wryly.
I must be the mother of fools to have agreed to this idiocy.
Herdalis clapped a commiserating hand up her shoulder.
We are all of us fools for her.
End of chapter.